Matthew Bell with Alzheimer'sProof.com, and today I want to tackle the question of when it becomes obvious that your loved one can no longer safely live by him or herself. So signs that your loved one cannot be living alone. Now, in marital situations, the spouse is often the very first caretaker that a disabled or cognitively impacted loved one is going to have. But if both spouses have some kind of an impairment, then you can run into difficulties even in a marital situation. But it is statistically probable that one spouse will predecease the other by at least a small period of time, and in that case, the survivor may find him or herself in a situation where they're living alone. And so I'm going to take a look at some of the signs that it is no longer safe for your loved one to be living in that situation. Obvious disclaimer here, I am not a medical professional. I cannot give you medical advice. I can tell you that this is simply some of the overflow of my own research as well as my experiences. My dad, Jim, died of Alzheimer's disease in 2016. I cared for him in his home for 4 years. He was then in a nursing home for 4 years after that. My grandmother died just this past June. She also had Alzheimer's disease. She was living by herself, and even though she didn't die from the Alzheimer's disease, she died with it. So I've had a fair bit of experience in terms of bumping up against this just in my own family. A couple of preliminaries. Who will this video primarily be for? And I envision it being for two main groups of people. The first is going to be somebody who has an aging relative, somebody who's just living on their own and may not have any diagnosis of cognitive impairment. And then on the other hand, a person who does have a diagnosis of cognitive impairment, most likely if they're still living by themselves, then they're going to have a mild cognitive impairment or some early form of Alzheimer's disease or some other dementia. So then the question becomes, at what point does that cognitive impairment cross the line? Or in the case of a person with no diagnosis, at what point does their physical disability rise to a level that prevents them from living by themselves? Or if they have no diagnosis, at what point does it become obvious that they are starting to develop some kind of a cognitive impairment? A couple of preliminaries. First of all, the baseline is going to be very important to take into consideration. Baseline, of course, is the level of cognitive activity or the level of cognitive function that a person has for most of their life. So in other words, just what their natural level is. A second preliminary is going to be that Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia come in stages. So before there is a bona fide dementia, there may be a mild cognitive impairment called MCI. Once you enter into a bona fide dementia, there still could be an early, middle, or late stage. There's different ways to carve that up, but just from that standpoint, a person, again, with mild impairment or with a mild form of some dementia may still be able to function even in a situation where they're living by themselves, but they're on borrowed time because at some point that cognitive impairment will become severe enough to prevent them from being safely able to dwell by themselves. Additionally, there can be other conditions, whether they're related to a dementia or Alzheimer's or whether they're completely separate, so that they could be a comorbidity or they could just be some other condition like a heart condition or arthritis or some other condition that prevents them from being totally able to take care of themselves. Now I'm going to give 5 overarching general categories of sign to watch out for. But these categories are, firstly, they're going to overlap with each other, so that's important to know. They're not bright lines that separate these categories. The second thing to realize about these categories is that they are going to dovetail with discussions about the loss of what are called activities of daily living, or ADLs, and these ADLs have to do with triggers for long-term care eligibility. There's also cognitive triggers, and they're going to all kind of just dovetail together. And the third thing, for people who might be coming to this video when they just have a loved one that they're worried about and they're not aware of any actual diagnosis of Alzheimer's or dementia, the third thing to be aware of is some of the signs that they're going to be unsafe living by themselves are also the same signs as those that are warning signs of some dementia or Alzheimer's disease. So in other words, the warning signs that I'm going to talk about that they're not safe to dwell by themselves are also coincidental, some of them are anyway, with signs of dementia. So category number 1 is losing the ability to perform household functions and household tasks. So this can be anything from they no longer seem to be able to keep a ledger, pay their bills on time, you're starting to see delinquent notices, their answering machine is starting to fill up with phone calls from bill collectors or people saying that their payments are late. Maybe their power gets turned off. You might see library books that are piled up that don't seem to have been returned on time. There could be clutter or messiness that is far above what you're used to. So again, baseline is going to be extraordinarily important to take into consideration here. You might be able to tell that the mess is changing from just paper to food scraps, or the carpet starts to become messier. They might start locking themselves out of the house more frequently. They might phone you to report that they're getting lost, or that they can't remember how to operate the microwave or the television. Mail starts piling up. From the standpoint of driving, you might start to notice dings or scratches on the car, or that it's not parked correctly. You might also notice that medications are kept in disarray, or you might suspect that their medications are not being taken on the appropriate schedule. Now, a second classification of warning sign is going to have to do with the activities of daily living. Now, the tasks that we just described are part of daily life, but here, by activities of daily living, or ADLs, we mean something specific. So in the long-term care industry, you're often going to find reference to these. I've talked about them in many other places, and in fact, I go into greater detail on them in other places. But most of the lists are going to be about 5, 6, 7 ADLs. The list that I tend to repeat goes like this, that you might find that they're unable to bathe by themselves, dress themselves, feed themselves. They might be unable to toilet by themselves, transfer, for example, in and out of bed by themselves, or they might lack, number 6, the ability to control their bodily functions. For example, bladder function, bowel function, and the like of that. Now, some of these are extraordinarily obvious, but others might be a little more subtle. They might start to lose their balance more frequently and be at greater risk of falling. They might have fallen several times. Their gait might begin to slow. You might start to notice that their hygiene has slipped. They might look unkempt or disheveled. Their mobility might have been severely increased, and that may be the case even if there are mechanical helps like walkers or grab bars in the house. Now, fourth category is going to be cognitive. So with respect to the ADLs, there can also be a cognitive trigger for long-term care eligibility. And once again, these cognitive triggers are also going to be a sign that a person may be unsafe to live by themselves. Just a word on this. Some research suggests that physical disability might actually be a harbinger of cognitive disability to come. So if you start noticing things like poor balance or slowing gait, it could be an indication that there's some looming cognitive impairment on the horizon. But cognition, they might start to lose the ability to have abstract concepts, to handle and think about abstract concepts. They might become confused or disoriented more frequently in situations where that previously didn't occur. They might start to suffer from poor judgment. Their language faculties might decline. They might start having to search for the proper word more frequently than they did before. Of course, memory problems might surface. Sometimes this is referred to as dementia. They might repeat themselves. They might start to lose spatial reasoning abilities or spatial awareness. And in general, they may just start to have a more erratic thought process going on. Now, the fourth category is just going to be general health concerns, physical in nature. So they might have body changes, body weight reductions, and this might become obvious to you in virtue of the fact that there's uneaten food in the refrigerator, or that they don't seem to be grocery shopping. So once again, in terms of the dovetailing, you can see that the daily functional tasks in the house might also dovetail with some of these physical health signs as well. They might have other sorts of conditions that come into play. Their physical health might be declining in other respects. I said weight loss, but there can be other symptoms of this as well. They might have a different color. My dad, for instance, because of a heart condition that he had that we didn't know about at first, started to really look wan and pale. Of course, a person who's aging might also have hearing or vision problems, and those are going to kind of dovetail with the cognition as well. Now, the fifth category is going to be health problems that have to do with mental health. So once again, all the things that we said with respect to cognition could also be said here, but I really have in mind those kinds of behavioral or psychological changes that are in a sense different from cognition. So maybe mood disorders. They might become agitated, and agitation can be a sign of Alzheimer's or dementia. They might be apathetic. They might become depressed. In more serious situations, they might also have a proclivity to experience hallucinations or paranoia. They might become reclusive and withdraw in social situations. They might lose interest in hobbies and activities that they previously loved and enjoyed. And once again, these perceptual changes can also factor in here as well. One that I'll note is that an early warning sign for dementia can also be the loss of smell. So there's something called the peanut butter smell test that people are actually researching as a possible non-invasive way to get an early fix on whether a person may have a cognitive impairment. So let me just draw some of these things together. So once again, in terms of where your situation might be, if you have a loved one that you are unaware that they have a diagnosis of any kind of cognitive impairment or dementia, then you should be aware that some of the warning signs that I just articulated, for instance, the cognitive impairment signs, some physical disabilities, but also some of the mental and mood disorder problems might be early signs of dementia. In addition to that, there are other triggers, for example, the loss of the various activities of daily living, like bathing yourself or feeding yourself, that are possible triggers for long-term care eligibility. So you want to keep an eye on things, understand the situation that your loved one is in. In other videos, I get into discussions about long-term care insurance coverage and other things that might be relevant in your situation. You might have to assist your loved one with trying to puzzle through some of those things. Obviously, once something like that manifests, it's going to be too late to apply for a policy. But if they have a policy, you may not know it and they may have forgotten about it. So you want to try and get a fix on what their situation is. My own interest, as I said previously, my dad died of Alzheimer's disease. My grandma had it when she died, even though she died of a heart condition. And so I can tell you that I have some personal experience with these things. And my website project, alzheimersproof.com, essentially has a twofold purpose. The first one is to help you in a situation where a loved one is in their house, and particularly if you have to have caretaker duties. The Alzheimer's Proof project includes tips and suggestions for how to make their home environment or your home environment safer and more conducive to caring for them. But the second thrust of the project is essentially those changes that you can make to diet, lifestyle, and other things in your own life to try to prevent yourself from manifesting some kind of a dementia, especially if, like me, it runs in your family. And in my case, of course, it runs in both sides. So I wish you all the best. If you found something of use in this video, I ask that you like it, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell to be alerted to new content as it becomes available. I invite you to check out my project, alzheimersproof.com. I thank you very much for being with me today, and I look forward to seeing you again in another video. Thank you.